Imagine someone gives you a book, and it's an incredibly exciting book. It draws you in a lot of different ways. But there are sections about the book, while fascinating, other sections don't seem to hold together. You sort of like the book, but at the same time, you sort of don't find the book worthwhile at all. Then your friend comes back to you one day and says of your book, there is actually a missing chapter. I've found the center. I found the key to the whole story. So read this. Now when you read the whole book with that one chapter in view, the book takes on an entirely new meaning. The missing chapter not only explains the confusing parts of the book, the missing chapter also opens up sections that you couldn't see before. Now you're able to read the book with joy because you understand the beauty and the profundity of the book. It all seems to make sense. Like a key that unlocks the door, the pin has fallen and everything seems to make sense at last. The radical claim of Christmas is that the coming of Jesus Christ into the world, it is the missing chapter of all of reality, of human history, and indeed our very lives. Jesus Christ is the key to all the themes and all the plots of the one big unified story of the Bible. And Jesus is also the clue to understanding the beauty and the profundity of our own lives as well. If you receive the missing chapter into your heart, then it will make sense and it will pierce your heart. Yet if you reject this missing chapter, then you will be left in confusion and indeed in darkness. Maybe you're the sort of person that's picked up the Bible before and you've had your way into the start of the Gospel of Matthew and you've read through the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Well, that's exactly what we're into in this very brief Bible talk in the Redeemer Queens Park community. Welcome back. Redeemer does exist to help connect Jesus to people, people to community, and community to mission. And let's have a look at the first 17 verses of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. The word genealogy means origins. This is the resume story, or this is the origin story of how Jesus came into the world. Look at the first 17 verses of Matthew chapter 1. Set them on the screen right here for you. You're reading through, and you and me were probably wondering, man, am I understanding these words in the right way? Am I pronouncing this in the right way? Yeah, that's what we think. But people would have read this for the very first time. They would have read a resume. They would have read Jesus' resume, his credentials, his proof for why he is the true and authoritative king of the world. Matthew starts his story. He starts this missing chapter in a different way than you would start fairy tales. You'll notice this doesn't begin once upon a time as in a fairy tale or the beginning of a Star Wars movie. No, Matthew says, this is the record. Let me tell you what happened. Let's have just 4 observations about what we see in the first 17 verses of the Gospel of Matthew. The first thing we see is this massive truth. Jesus is the center of history. When we see it this way, we learn that all of history literally is his story. It's the story of Jesus Christ. The entire Old Testament story is the story of promises made, and the entire New Testament story is the story of promises kept, and they're all kept right around Jesus Christ. This genealogy of Jesus Christ, importantly, it shows us that Jesus Christ is indeed a historical being. There's more evidence for the fact of Jesus Christ than many people from antiquity that claim to have lived before. And we see here that Jesus is the culmination of God's working in the world. We see that Jesus is the substance of what all heroes in the past were pointing forward to. And if you wanted to glance just again at the first 17 verses of the book of Matthew, we'll see this genealogy is arranged into 3 different segments. The first segment, we see that God saves his people from Egypt. In the second section, we see that kings were risen up. They were raised up in Israel, but because they were disobedient, God exiled them. And then in the third segment, we see the people of Israel are in captivity and in obscurity. In each of the 3 segments to this genealogy, we see it's marked by both disappointment and by grace. And here comes Jesus Christ to fill up what's lacking in the disappointment that we see because he is the grace that was promised all along. When Matthew wrote this, none of the major actors in history at the time were paying attention to Jesus. Think about it. Jesus was born to an obscure family in a small backwater Middle Eastern country. Nobody in Rome, nobody in Athens was paying attention to him, but that's where the real action was. But no one took any notice. And when Jesus died on that old Roman cross, very few people outside of Israel had even heard of him. And yet Matthew, he shows us that despite what our lives may look like on the surface, God is guiding all of history according to his perfect plan. And that means that the powers of this world that might appear that they're at the center, well, in the end, we'll find out that they are indeed not. Everything in Rome literally fed back to these moments as well. And listen, church, it's a sign of Christian maturity to be able to relate all things back to Jesus as well. It's a sign of maturity in our own lives and in our community at large when we can understand everything that is happening and then related to God's major movements in the world. Christians are becoming the kind of people that can look at everything from world politics to the specific details of our own lives and say, yeah, but this is what God is actually up to. So yeah, Jesus is the center of history, but beautifully notice this as well. Jesus came for the outsiders in this world. Jesus works in ways that we do not expect, and this genealogy proves that up for us. Notice the 5 women mentioned in this genealogy. We might call them gender outsiders of the day. Yeah, when Jesus walked on this earth, women were not held in high regard. Women were often treated as the property of husbands. And Jesus came along and Jesus elevated the honor, the worth, and the dignity of women. Yeah, Jesus came for the gender outsiders. Most of the women were Gentiles. You might call them racial outsiders as well. And Matthew goes out of his way to mention some of the most sinful incidents in the Old Testament and to attach those to the story of Jesus. Yeah, we could even conclude Jesus came for the moral outsiders as well. So I just wonder if you could identify with this. Can you identify as a gender outsider? Could you identify as a racial outsider? Could you identify when it comes to Jesus as a moral outsider? Well, pay attention, because here he is, and he's coming for us in his grace and in his love. What does this mean? Well, this means that Jesus will own us as outsiders. Despite our sin, he is not ashamed of us. What a glorious truth that Christmas can offer us. This is supposed to send us a message. Jesus came to include us, no matter who we are, no matter what our family ties may be. The names that were given in this genealogy are included in the line that leads to Christ so that we can know we too can be included in the line that leads from the cross of Christ as well. Jesus Christ specializes in the broken. He specializes in the weak, and he can help you, and he can help us. As a church, we endeavor for our core message to be the message for the outsider. We don't want to be a church that's able to simply put on a good show. We want to be a church that preaches Christ to the overlooked in our communities. Notice third, Jesus can also overcome the chaos in our own lives as well. Another thing we notice about this genealogy is about how many people in it had embarrassing stories. There's a lot of awkward and embarrassing moments here. And no king's genealogy, if you're making this stuff up, would you include this kind of stuff? This is the kind of stuff that is embarrassing, and yet it's included and even attached to the name of Jesus. The big idea here is that God is working to form a community to be his own possession. And he's working not just around their sin, he's working to overcome their sin, to overcome their brokenness, to overcome their weakness. And let's get really practical for you and me as a community as well. Many of us, we have messy dysfunction in our own lives. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that God is pleased with the pain that's come into our lives. He was brokenhearted by it. He is the perfect Father. And just like you and me would feel anger if someone hurt one of our children, it angers God when someone hurts one of his children. But what we need to see in these moments is God's overriding purpose in spite of our pain. In the face of our chaotic mess, Jesus is indeed at the center. Imagine with me a beautiful tapestry. It feels chaotic to make, but then God flips it over and the perfect picture is there with not one strand out of place. He does that with the genealogy of Jesus, and he can do this with you and me today. But here's our objection. Sometimes we flag up at the ways and the purposes of God, and we look at our God and we say, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. But Charles Spurgeon, the 19th century British pastor, he compared that statement to a person who pops up their head into a theater in the middle of a stage play, watches only 2 minutes, throws up his hands in the air and says, this is stupid. This doesn't make any sense. Well, think about it. Of course it doesn't make any sense. You've only seen 2 minutes, and that 2 minutes needs to be interpreted and part of the story as a whole. Our adult lives are what? 50, 60, 70, maybe 80 years? And we look around our lives right now and we say to our God, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but what do we really understand? I'm 36 years old. This means I've seen about 1 millisecond of a 5-hour movie. I can't explain from that 1 millisecond how it all ties together. But the Gospel of Matthew shows us that it does. And Jesus is at the center. And Jesus is the one who can overrule and he can bring peace to the chaos in our lives. And that's because this final truth is there and it holds it all together. Jesus is not good advice. Jesus Christ is good news. Think about it with me. If the Christmas story were simply a sweet story to tell us how to live our lives, then what in the world is the Christmas story telling us to do? To quit our day jobs and to go be shepherds? To walk around and look up into the stars and just find a big one and follow it? Is it telling us to just go out into the countryside and give birth outdoors? No, thank you. No, if the Christmas story is merely meant to inspire, then we must consider what would it ever be inspiring us to do? The gospel then. It is not good advice. The gospel is good news. If an army were invading, what you and I would need is a military general telling us how to defend ourselves. But if you were the king, and if you had defeated the enemy, what would you do? You would simply send messengers into the villages to tell people, no defense is no longer necessary. A conquering king has won, and he wants to invite you into the way of his kingdom. So Christ coming as the perfect king all at once, well, he would have crushed us. He would have come as the judge to repay all evil once and for all, and that would have left us without hope. But look at him. Christ comes as the humble babe, growing up to be a suffering servant, the one who comes with the blood of adulterers and murderers and Gentiles flowing in his veins. Only this one can save us. And he shared our humanity. So says the book of Hebrews, he took our sins and our sorrows and he made them his very own. So what this means for us this Christmas season, it means that our personal stories, they can make sense if we bring this missing chapter into our lives, allow it to be the key that unlocks our lives and makes sense of everything. It means that our awkwardness, it means that our embarrassing mistakes, it means that God can come along and only God can redeem. It means that God, when he's looking into our lives and we look around our lives and we think, man, this life has to be over. The divorce is final. The job is lost. The kids are kicked out of school or the kids won't speak to me. We look around, it's like I long for a spouse, or some of us are just saying, I just long for a friend. Look at this genealogy. Look at the genealogy of Jesus and learn a lesson, my friend. This means that it's in these moments where Jesus might actually be preparing his best work of grace and redemption for each and every one of us. And finally, and let's rest our souls here. Why have all of these numbers in chapter 1, verse 17? Why focus on 14 generations? Well, it's because Jesus Christ is the seventh seven. Jesus Christ is the perfect number. He's the number of fulfillment. 7 is the day that the Creator rested. And Jesus being the perfect 7 means you and me can find rest for our souls as well. In Jesus Christ, you can stop trying to prove yourself. He's already proven enough for you. And in Jesus Christ, we know that the ideal has begun to come into the world and invade the real. And one day the ideal will take over the real at last, and he will indeed rule the world altogether. Jesus Christ is not just another bit of good advice for you to follow in your life. He's good news. The King has come. And he has come in humility to conquer our greatest evils for us. He only invites us to welcome him into our hearts with openness and humility. Let's find ourselves there this Christmas season, Redeemer family, in the days ahead.